Chris Bennett believes that marijuana is the so-called tree of life mentioned in the Bible. He has filed legal action against the federal health department so he can lawfully smoke pot as part of his religious beliefs. By denying him an exemption to legally smoke and grow marijuana, he says he is being forced to choose between his religious beliefs and his personal security. One of his most recent publications is Sex, Drugs, Violence, and the Bible. Chris Bennett joins me in studio. Thanks.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So the Bible has lots of references to herbs. Some are very specific, frankincense, myrrh. Some are very generic. And you contend that at least some of those generic references to herb is cannabis?
Well, specifically, as far as cannabis is concerned, I think what we have to do is go back to the Old Hebrew for the Old Testament references. And an anthropologist writing in the 1930s, Sula Bennett, pointed out two Hebrew words, kenna and kennabossum, which she said were references to cannabis.
These are Hebrew words.
Hebrew words. And what had happened is in 300 BC, roughly, when the Hebrew texts were translated into Greek, these references were mistranslated as calamus. And this mistranslation followed through in later translations of the Bible down to the King James and down to modern times. But when you look at these references in the context of the biblical storyline and you place cannabis in them instead of calamus, it really changes vastly the whole biblical scenario.
And what is calamus?
Calamus is a common marsh root that it grows in the Middle East. The references to cannabossum and canna specifically refer to an item of trade, so it's something that came from somewhere else. And the terms themselves, canna and cannabossum, are Hebrew adoptions of an Indo-European name for cannabis, canna. And this came in as an item of trade to the Hebrews. And in the first of these references, Exodus 30:23, God, who ironically appears to Moses in flames of fire from within a burning bush, commands Moses to make this holy anointing oil with about 9 pounds of this cannabossum, which is sometimes translated as fragrant grain, sometimes translated as calamus, mixed with myrrh and cinnamon into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And every time that Moses is to speak to the Lord, he goes into this enclosure called the tent of the meeting. He covers himself in this oil, and THC, the active ingredient in cannabis, is fatty soluble and can pass through the skin. And he places some of this oil on the incense altar, he burns it, and he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the incense altar. The pillar of smoke is actually referred to as the Shekinah in Hebrew and refers to the physical presence of God. So Moses is only talking to God when there is smoke pouring out of the tent of the meeting. So when you throw cannabis into that
saying
scenario,
Moses was a pothead, basically.
Yeah, well, basically I'm saying that Moses was like a shaman who, like shamans in South America and Africa, often ingest psychoactive plants and then interpret the experience they have from those psychoactive plants as some sort of spiritual revelation.
Right. So tell me about this legal case. You're contending that as a Christian, I assume you're a Christian?
Well, I'm more of like, I guess, a neo-Gnostic, Gnostic Christian kind of, I don't know how much you know about ancient Christianity, but I'd kind of fall into that class. I don't believe in things like virgin birth or the resurrection.
So you're using the Bible as the Christian Bible as a reference, the Christian and the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah, definitely
as a reference, saying that's somehow relevant to you.
Yeah, it is definitely relevant to me. I do believe that cannabis is the tree of life, and I'm a part of a church that recognizes cannabis as the tree of life, and people all across North America are starting to recognize cannabis as the tree of life.
Well, so let's step back for a minute. Tree of life. Define that term.
Well, it appears in two places in the Bible, the beginning of the Bible in the Garden of Eden alongside the tree of knowledge, and these are forbidden. And at the end of the Bible, where a figure in the Bible, an angel, says that I will give to you to eat from the tree which is in the midst of the garden. And then the last paragraph on the Bible, Revelations 22, reads, on either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And 20 years ago, I read that verse, and shortly after I'd found out about industrial hemp and medicinal marijuana and a number of these applications. And when I read that, I had this religious revelation that cannabis was that tree of life, and I started thinking about people like Bob Marley and some of these Rastafarian groups that were pointing out to the same thing, and I'd never really thought about it before. And then shortly after having this experience, I found out about a church in Ontario, the Church of the Universe, which recognizes cannabis as a tree of life and has done so since 1969. And I joined that church, and I've been a reverend with that church. And that church has suffered through tremendous legal persecution, and currently the founders of the church, Brother Walter and Brother Michael, are in Ontario jail for half an ounce of cannabis.
So it's as part of this church that you contend that you have the legal, that you should have the legal right to grow and smoke marijuana. So tell me about the case.
Well, basically what we did is myself and my lawyer, Kirk Tusaw, we wrote the health minister and asked for an exemption 56 for the spiritual use of cannabis, outlining my history and background. And exemption 56 is where what the medical marijuana was granted under prior to the medical marijuana program we have here federally in Canada. And also through other people, we understand that the government has granted such a religious exemption for a very powerful psychoactive substance known as ayahuasca, which is a visionary tea from the Amazon basin. So there's been these precedents set with medical marijuana and possibly this ayahuasca thing, which we're trying to find out more about. So basically, we're asking the health minister to extend that exemption process that they have for medical marijuana to include spiritual users like myself. And this was refused. The refusal opens it up to a judicial review of the Justice Minister's decision, where we can bring up all the charter issues of freedom of religion in court, which is very hard to do in criminal cases because criminal cases happen provincially, and it's been very unsuccessful so far, although numbers of people have tried to take the religious issue into federal court. And this will be the first time that these issues are dealt with in federal court.
I know that in the United States, perhaps there haven't been analogous cases here, but in the United States, First Nations groups, or Native Americans as they're called in the States, have argued the use of peyote as part of it.
They have a federal exemption in the United States. In the case of marijuana in the United States, they say that it's, because of the greater public interest, they're not going to extend that to cannabis. In Canada, what happened with peyote is they decided to leave it completely off the schedule. Peyote is not a scheduled substance, although the active chemical mescaline is. They left it off of the schedule because they were concerned if they created an exemption for people like in the Native American church, this may open it up to Rastafarians and other groups going for religious exemptions. So they thought they would bypass that precedent by doing that. In the case of Canada, my request was refused based on public interest, the idea that somehow my use of spiritual cannabis is a problem for the greater good, but we have the medical marijuana program in place and the greater public interest has still been served.
All right, great. Well, listen, there's a lot more to talk about, more with Chris Bennett when the Standard returns. Welcome back to The Standard. We're joined once again by writer Chris Bennett, who is asking for the right to grow and consume marijuana for religious reasons. So, I'm sure a lot of people watching, or certainly some people watching, are thinking this is a gimmick. This is a sort of, you're using religion as your excuse to basically smoke pot, which can be argued one way or another, but religion may not really be the heart of what you're doing. How do you respond to that?
I would say to those people, try Googling Jesus Cannabis and see how much information comes up on that. I have a 20-year history of using cannabis as a religious sacrament that's been well established, and I've written 3 big books on the history of cannabis in religion and magic. And I probably know more about that particular history than anybody else. I have a very sincere belief that cannabis is the tree of life, that people like Moses and Jesus used cannabis, that cannabis has been used in India in honor of gods like Shiva and Kali, the goddess, that cannabis has played a major role in the Islamic religion among Sufis. And, in this cultural milieu which we live in the 21st century, I am part of all of those traditions and all of those cultural uses. And my own experience with cannabis, has shown me that it is the most beneficial and wonderful thing there is on earth. And no matter what religion you are, no matter what faith and doctrine you believe in, whatever Bible or holy book you believe in, that book has been written by the hands of man. But God created the plants of this earth. And no matter what God you believe in, you better believe that God created cannabis. And he put it here for a purpose. He or she put it here for a purpose.
We talked about Moses and his potential use of marijuana in your interpretation. But you just mentioned Jesus, so are you suggesting Jesus also smoked pot?
What happens when you follow the history of these references to cannabis in the Old Testament is eventually the whole thing gets prohibited. There's this holy anointing oil and incenses that are used by the priest castes and the kings, and they're eventually prohibited as the Jewish kingdom grows into a big empire, and they're more so focused on things like laws and taxes and things like that, moving away from sort of shamanistic exploits. But the name Christ itself is a Greek translation of a Hebrew term, Messiah. And that term means the anointed ones. It makes direct reference to this anointing oil. And many of the so-called miracles in the New Testament are actually ailments which cannabis has been used to treat medically, even in our modern times. And when you take a look back at the history of the early Christian church and what was going on over the first few centuries, this anointing oil played a pivotal role, but it was forced into the background as the Roman Catholic Church came into power and water baptism took great over it. But texts from the time period say there was fire in the anointing oil, and through the anointing oil we're initiated into unfading bliss. Well, there was only water in the baptism. So they make it quite specific that there was a certain power in this anointing oil. And they apply it to numbers of ailments like crooked limbs and skin diseases and stuff like that. And so it's very specific that it has healing qualities, and they even refer to it as the plant of kindness being in the holy oil. So it's very, very specific, and in the inception of the Dark Ages, a large part of that has to do with the suppression of pagan religions and other religions, as well as scores of other Christian groups known collectively under the name Gnosticism, which had a very different view of Christianity than that which has come down to us through the New Testament, which was put together around 350 AD, roughly, out of numbers of books. It was edited down. Luckily, in our own time, we've rediscovered many Christian texts via the Gnostic Library, discovered in Nag Hammadi, as well as the influence of the earlier Dead Sea Scrolls, which predate Christianity. And taking a look at these texts here, we can really show that there was a huge role for these cannabis-based anointing oils and incenses in the early Christian period. And people can find out about this by simply Googling Jesus Cannabis.
Well, let's take for the sake of argument that you're right, that there is this connection between cannabis and the Bible. I think a lot of people still argue, not necessarily focused on your case, but using the Bible as a reference for laws is a dangerous, slippery slope.
Have you ever read the Canadian, it's all based in God.
Right.
And people swear on the Bible.
Right.
So it's all clearly instituted.
But then when you get to issues like gay marriage, or issues like abortion.
Which I'm supportive of gay marriage and issues like abortion. I'm not, as I said, I recognize cannabis as used by Moses, as used by Jesus in the Bible, but I also recognize it in the Vedas. I recognize it in other religious texts and religious traditions and stuff like that. So I don't want to give you the impression that my view is like some sort of orthodox biblical view. My belief is that cannabis is the tree of life. That's what the basis, the fundamental belief in the Church of the Universe is that cannabis is the tree of life. Members of the Church of the Universe are obligated to promote the use of cannabis as the tree of life, whether that be through, selling hemp clothes and hemp food and providing hemp medicines and stuff like that. And that's the central pillar of our religion. Maybe in some Christian churches it might be the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. That's the central pillar of their religion. In our religion, it's that cannabis is the tree of life, and as it's for the healing of the nations, all of the world's traditions that have evolved around cannabis are part of that tree of life.
Well, tell me about the book that you've most recently written.
Yeah, I've just been finished up a book called Cannabis and the Soma Solution, which is coming out in February with an American publishing company, Trying Day. Basically, that book follows the history of cannabis in ancient Indo-European culture. Indo-Europeans are the ancestors, the Indo-European language is the ancestors of French, English, German, even Sanskrit in India, Persian language. All these different languages come from the Indo-European language. And the oldest evidence we have of people using cannabis for intoxicating purposes actually originates in the Ukraine region. And it's like 3500 BC, people were burning cannabis in incense centers in the Ukraine region and inhaling the fumes for shamanic purposes. These same people were the first people to domesticate the horse and master horseback riding. And these people spread cannabis throughout the ancient world, affecting a number of traditions. They even went up into China. In the last few years, they've discovered a 2,700-year-old Caucasian mummy in China that was buried with 2 pounds of female cannabis. And this cannabis had been cultivated for its intoxicating purposes.
This is what year?
2,700 years ago, 700 BC. This same group here picked up the Chinese name for cannabis, Huma. In China, cannabis had been used by Taoist religions for some centuries prior to this as the plant of immortality. These same people took cannabis down into the Afghanistan region, where it was adopted by a culture known as the Mazdian culture. culture, who later became known as Zoroastrians and became the drink Heoma, from the Chinese huma, we get the Heoma. These same people then traded into India, where the Heoma became Soma. And this is a source of the Vedic religion, which inspired the Indian religion. And clearly the Soma was considered as the inspirational fount from which that religion grew. There's whole books dedicated to the intoxicating powers of the Soma and its use as an inspirational force for spirituality. And, you know, this is identical to the same way that it's influenced musical movements, like the Rastafarian reggae movement has all been influenced by it, or the rock and roll movement of the 60s, you know what I mean? All these movements, the jazz movement of the 30s, all these inspirational and creative forces have been inspired by cannabis.
Oh, well, we just have a couple moments left, but what's next with your case?
November 3rd, we appear in court. We've given our affidavits of information that we're going to supply, as well as who our expert witnesses are going to be, Professor Carl Ruck, Professor of Classical Mythology, and Professor Scott Littleton, a Professor of Indo-European Studies. We will establish a long, strong history of cannabis, and I will connect myself to that historical stream.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing all this with us.
Thank you.
More of The Standard when we return.